The sun blazed mercilessly over Jake Morrison's cattle ranch in the heart of Texas, where the red dirt stretched endlessly toward the horizon. For 3 days straight, his donkeys had been acting strange, circling the massive oak tree at the property's edge like they were possessed, braying and pawing at the ground with an urgency that made Jake's weathered hands shake. He'd seen animals act peculiar before storms, but this was different. This felt wrong. What Jake didn't know was that 25 years ago, as a rookie sheriff's deputy, he'd helped cover up a crime that would haunt him forever. The missing person case that was never solved, the evidence that was never found, the guilt that drove him to abandon his badge and retreat to this isolated ranch. As Jake approached the tree with his shovel, the donkeys stepped back in eerie silence, as if they knew what he was about to discover. The first strike of metal against earth revealed something that made his blood run cold, something that proved his past had finally caught up with him. But what exactly had those donkeys been trying to tell him all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake Morrison pulled his sweat-stained hat lower over his eyes as he studied the 3 donkeys standing motionless beside the ancient oak. Delilah, Moses, and Buttercup had been his faithful companions for the better part of a decade, reliable as the sunrise and twice as predictable. Until 3 days ago. The massive oak had stood sentinel on his property since before his grandfather's time, its gnarled branches reaching toward heaven like arthritic fingers. Jake had always felt drawn to the tree, purchasing this particular stretch of land partly because of its majestic presence. Now, watching his animals behave like they'd lost their minds around it, he wondered if that attraction had been misguided. He'd tried everything to break their obsession. Fresh hay in the opposite pasture, new salt licks by the barn, even bribing them with sugar cubes. Nothing worked. They returned to the oak like metal filings to a magnet, wearing a perfect circle into the red earth with their restless pacing. The morning heat was already brutal at 8 o'clock, promising another scorching day. Jake wiped his forehead with his sleeve and approached the tree cautiously. The donkeys watched him with an intelligence that unnerved him, their dark eyes following his every movement. "What is it, girl?" he asked Delilah, the eldest of the 3. She was a grey jenny with white patches around her muzzle, wise beyond her years. She nickered softly and pawed the ground near the tree's massive root system. Jake knelt where she indicated, running his calloused hands over the disturbed earth. The soil felt different here, looser, as if it had been excavated and refilled. Strange, considering this tree had stood untouched for over a century. A chill ran down his spine despite the oppressive heat. In his 20 years as a lawman before retiring to ranch life, he'd developed instincts that rarely led him astray. Those same instincts were screaming now, warning him that whatever lay beneath this earth would change everything. He retrieved a shovel from his pickup truck, his movements deliberate and measured. The donkeys formed a semicircle around him, their earlier agitation replaced by an almost reverent stillness. It was as if they understood the gravity of the moment. The first shovelful of dirt came away easily, confirming his suspicions about the disturbed soil. As he dug deeper, memories began surfacing unbidden, fragments of cases he'd tried to forget, faces of victims whose families never got closure, and one particular autumn night that had altered the trajectory of his entire life. 25 years. Had it really been that long since he'd turned in his badge and walked away from everything he'd once believed in? The guilt had followed him to this remote corner of Texas, where he'd hoped the endless sky and honest work would wash away the stain on his soul. But sins had a way of surfacing, just like whatever was buried beneath this tree. At 18 inches down, his shovel struck something that wasn't earth or root. The metallic clang echoed across the empty pasture like a death knell. Jake's hands trembled as he cleared away the remaining soil, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a metal box. The donkeys pressed closer, their earlier restlessness replaced by an almost human curiosity. Delilah nudged his shoulder gently, as if encouraging him to continue. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he fully unearthed the container. It was an old ammunition box, the kind military surplus stores sold by the dozens. The metal was corroded but intact, sealed tight against the elements. He sat back on his heels, staring at the box as if it might explode. Whatever was inside had been placed here deliberately, buried with care and marked only by the towering oak that had kept its secret for God knew how long. The desert wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead with a sound like whispered confessions. In the distance, a meadowlark called out, its song somehow mournful in the vast emptiness. Jake Morrison reached for the rusted latch, knowing that opening this box would either damn him or set him free. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pasture as Jake Thornton pulled on his worn leather boots, the floorboards of his cabin creaking under his weight. Through the window he could see them, those 3 damn donkeys still circling that oak tree like they were performing some ancient ritual. They'd been at it for 3 days straight now, and it was starting to get under his skin in ways he couldn't quite explain. He'd owned Bonnie, Clyde, and May for the better part of 15 years, and they'd never acted like this before. Sure, donkeys could be stubborn, but this wasn't stubbornness. This was something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up every time he watched them through the kitchen window while drinking his morning coffee. Jake stepped onto his porch, the wood weathered gray from decades of Montana winters, and squinted against the early light. The donkeys were about 200 yards out, moving in their endless clockwise circle around the massive oak that had stood on his property since before his grandfather's time. Their hoofbeats had worn a distinct path in the earth, creating a perfect ring around the tree's base. He'd tried everything he could think of to break their trance. Yesterday morning, he'd walked out with a bucket of oats, their favorite treat, and called to them. They'd looked up, ears twitching, but hadn't broken formation. Not one of them had stepped outside that invisible boundary they'd created. When he'd gotten closer, trying to lead Bonnie away by her halter, she'd planted her feet and refused to budge beyond the circle's edge. The moment he'd released her, she'd resumed her methodical walking. The whole thing reminded him of something, though he couldn't put his finger on what. A memory lurked at the edge of his consciousness, something unpleasant that made his stomach churn whenever he tried to grasp it. Jake descended the porch steps and walked toward the pasture, his boots crunching on the frost-brittle grass. As he got closer, he could hear them breathing, see the steam rising from their nostrils in the cool air. Their eyes had a glazed quality, like they weren't fully present, weren't fully themselves. "What's got into you 3?" he muttered, stopping at the fence line. The oak tree itself was unremarkable in most ways. Thick trunk, sprawling branches, leaves that turned brilliant gold each autumn. His grandfather had told him stories about it when Jake was a boy, claimed it was over 200 years old, that the Crow Indians used to hold ceremonies beneath its branches. But those were just old man stories, the kind every ranch seemed to accumulate over the generations. Except now, watching his donkeys pace their endless circle, those stories felt different, more substantial, like maybe there was truth hiding in the old tales after all. Jake climbed through the fence rails and approached the worn path. The moment his boot crossed into the circle, all 3 donkeys stopped dead in their tracks and turned to stare at him. Their ears pricked forward, and for a moment they looked like themselves again, curious, alert, intelligent. "Easy there," he said softly, extending his hand toward Bonnie. She took a step toward him, then another, until she was close enough to nuzzle his palm. Her nose was warm and dry, completely normal. "What's this all about, girl?" But the moment Jake stepped back outside the circle, the spell resumed. Bonnie shook her head as if clearing cobwebs and fell back into line with the others. Within seconds, they were walking again, their hooves finding the worn groove in the earth with mechanical precision. A chill ran down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. He'd seen animals act strangely before storms, before earthquakes, when predators were near. But this was different. This felt deliberate, purposeful, like they were guarding something. or trying to tell him something he was too thick-headed to understand. He walked around the outside of their path, studying the ground, looking for anything unusual. The grass was trampled, sure enough, but beneath it the earth looked different. Disturbed, maybe, though that could just be from 3 days of constant foot traffic. Still, there were spots where the ground seemed to dip slightly, as if something underneath had settled or shifted. Jake knelt and pressed his palm against the earth. It felt soft, looser than it should be for ground that hadn't been worked in decades. He grabbed a handful of soil and let it sift through his fingers. Dark, rich dirt that looked almost too fertile for this part of the pasture. As he crouched there, letting the soil fall from his hand, a memory surfaced unbidden. Summer of 1987. Sarah Beth Morrison, 17 years old, walking toward this very tree during the last town barbecue his family had hosted, her red sundress bright against the green grass, her laugh carrying on the evening breeze. That was the last time anyone had seen her alive. Jake's hand trembled as the memory crystallized, sharp and clear after 35 years of being buried. The search parties, the questions, the suspicious looks that followed him for months afterward. He thought he'd left all that behind. The donkeys hadn't moved an inch by morning. If anything, they'd worn the circle deeper, their hooves carving a perfect ring around the massive oak like some kind of ritual dance floor. Jack stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the cool dawn air, watching the 3 stubborn animals continue their endless procession. Something was wrong here, dead wrong. He'd owned this ranch for 15 years, bought it dirt cheap from old Henderson's widow after the man died of a heart attack. The donkeys had been part of the deal, 3 aging animals that Henderson had kept as pets rather than working stock. In all that time, they'd been gentle, predictable creatures. They grazed, they slept, they occasionally brayed at coyotes. They didn't perform synchronized mystical ceremonies around trees. Jack pulled on his boots and grabbed his shovel from the tool shed. If the donkeys wouldn't tell him what was bothering them, maybe the ground would. He'd learned long ago to trust animal instincts. They sensed things humans missed, dangers that lurked just beyond the edge of perception. The donkeys parted as he approached, allowing him into their circle but never stopping their movement. It was like entering the eye of a slow-motion hurricane. The oak towered above him, its trunk easily 6 feet across, bark scarred by decades of weather and time. The exposed roots created a web of natural shells and hollows around the base. Jack started digging in the soft earth between 2 large roots, his shovel biting into soil that seemed oddly loose for ground that should have been packed hard by years of weather. After 20 minutes, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. The hole was already 2 feet deep when his shovel struck something that definitely wasn't rock. The metallic clang sent ice through his veins. He dropped to his knees and brushed dirt away with his hands, revealing the corner of what looked like an old metal box. His heart hammered as he worked to expose more of it, a battered strongbox, the kind banks used back in the 70s and 80s. The lock had long since rusted away. Jack sat back on his heels, staring at the box. Every instinct screamed at him to bury it again, to fill in the hole and pretend he'd never seen it. But the donkeys continued their circle, and he knew with grim certainty that they wouldn't stop until he dealt with whatever was inside. With trembling hands, he lifted the box from its earthen grave. It was heavier than expected, and something shifted inside when he moved it. He carried it to a flat section of ground and sat cross-legged beside it, the donkeys maintaining their vigil around him. The lid opened with a screech of protesting metal. The first thing he saw was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded yellow ribbon. Beneath that, a small leather journal with water-stained pages. At the bottom of the box lay something that made his blood run cold, a silver locket on a delicate chain, tarnished black with age. Jack knew that locket. He'd seen it every day for 3 months in 1987, had watched the morning sun catch its surface as it rested against the hollow of a woman's throat. Sarah Chen's throat. His hands shook as he lifted the locket, and the years collapsed around him like a house of cards. Sarah had been a private investigator from Denver, following a cold case that had brought her to the small town of Cedar Flats, 40 miles north of his current ranch. She'd been beautiful, brilliant, and utterly fearless in her pursuit of the truth. She'd also been asking questions about things that certain people preferred to keep buried. Then one day she was gone. Her car found abandoned on a mountain road, no sign of struggle, no trace of where she'd gone. The official investigation concluded she'd probably fallen into one of the old mine shafts that honeycombed the area. Case closed, file forgotten. But Jack knew better. He'd been a different man then, younger, angrier, working as muscle for people who solved problems, with violence rather than conversation. He'd known about the plans to silence Sarah Chen, had even been asked to participate. He'd refused and left town the same night, but he'd never reported what he knew, never tried to save her. Now, 35 years later, her locket was in his hands, pulled from the earth on his own property. The property he'd bought from Henderson, who'd been one of the men in those planning sessions all those decades ago. Jack opened the locket with a fingernail. Inside was a tiny photograph of an elderly Asian woman, probably Sarah's grandmother, and engraved on the opposite side were Chinese characters he couldn't read. Below that, in English, "Truth will find a way." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 15 years thinking he'd escaped his past, and all along Sarah Chen had been buried practically in his backyard, waiting for someone to find her, waiting for the truth to find a way. The donkeys continued their endless circle, and Jack understood now that they wouldn't stop until he finished what Sarah had started. The shovel struck something hard 3 feet down, sending a jarring vibration up Jake's arms that made his teeth clench. He'd been digging for the better part of an hour, sweat streaming down his weathered face despite the cool morning air. The donkeys had finally moved off to graze, but their earlier behavior still gnawed at him like a splinter under the nail. He knelt in the dirt and brushed soil away with his hands, revealing what looked like rotted wood. His pulse quickened. The grain was still visible beneath decades of decay, and as he cleared more earth, the unmistakable shape of a wooden crate emerged, about 2 feet square, maybe 8 inches deep, the kind of box someone might use to store important papers or valuables. Jake sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery. In 30 years of working this land, he'd never found so much as an old horseshoe buried anywhere on the property. Now this, right where the animals had been acting strange, right under the gnarled roots of the oak that had probably been standing here since before the Civil War. He lifted the box carefully, surprised by how light it felt. The wood crumbled slightly in his grip, but the structure held together. A simple iron latch, green with corrosion, secured the lid. Jake's hands trembled as he worked it free. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled canvas but now felt like old leather, lay a collection of items that made Jake's blood run cold. Photographs, a leather journal, and at the bottom, something that nearly stopped his heart entirely, a silver locket he recognized immediately. The photographs were old, black and white, but well preserved thanks to their wrapping. Jake held the first one up to the morning light and felt the world tilt beneath him. A young woman smiled back at him from the image, her dark hair pinned up in the fashion of the 1970s, her eyes bright with life. Sarah Martinez, the girl who had vanished from Millfield 43 years ago, leaving behind nothing but questions and a family destroyed by grief. The girl Jake had loved. The girl whose disappearance had driven him from his hometown and eventually to this remote ranch where he'd tried to bury his memories along with his past. His hands shook as he examined the other photographs. Sarah laughing by a creek he didn't recognize. Sarah standing next to a truck that wasn't his, her arm around someone who'd been carefully cut out of the picture. Sarah in places he'd never been with her, doing things he'd never known about. Jake opened the journal with the reverence of a man handling explosives. The first entry was dated 3 weeks before Sarah disappeared, written in her familiar looping handwriting. He doesn't suspect anything yet, but I'm getting scared. What started as easy money has turned into something darker. Tommy says we can't back out now, that we know too much, but I never signed up for this. I just wanted to help Mama with the medical bills. Tommy. Jake's chest tightened. Tommy Brennan had been Sarah's cousin, 2 years older and always in some kind of trouble. After Sarah vanished, Tommy had left town too, supposedly to look for work in California. Jake had always assumed the kid was just running from his grief and the questions that never seemed to stop coming. He flipped through more pages, his dread building with each entry. Sarah wrote about midnight meetings, packages that needed to be moved across state lines, and growing pressure from people she referred to only by initials. The picture that emerged was of a young woman who'd gotten caught up in something far beyond her understanding or control. The final entry, dated the day before she disappeared, consisted of only a few lines. They know I want out. RC made that clear tonight. I'm going to tell Jake everything tomorrow and hope he can help me figure out what to do if something happens to me. I've hidden the evidence where only someone who really knows this area would think to look. Under the witness tree, where the old boundary markers used to be, Jake looked up at the massive oak above him. The witness tree. Old-timers had called it that because it marked the corner where 3 original homestead claims met back in the 1800s. Sarah had known that story because Jake had told it to her during one of their rides through this very section, what was now his ranch. She'd hidden this box here, knowing that someday, somehow, he might find it. The locket lay heavy in his palm when he finally picked it up. Inside, he knew, was the tiny photograph of him she'd always carried, the one taken at the county fair 2 months before everything went wrong. But there was something else rattled inside the locket now. Something that hadn't been there before. With trembling fingers, Jake opened it. Alongside his young, smiling face was a small key, tarnished but intact, and wrapped around the key was a piece of paper with an address written in Sarah's careful script. An address in Millfield, a place Jake would have to return to no matter how much it terrified him. The shovel bit deep into the earth with a metallic scrape that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the still morning air. Jake had been digging for 20 minutes now, and sweat already darkened his flannel shirt, despite the cool temperature. The donkeys maintained their vigil, their hoofbeats wearing a deeper groove in the circle they'd been pacing for 3 days straight. Each thrust of the blade brought up more than just dirt and root fragments. Memories surfaced with every shovelful, memories he'd spent the better part of 30 years burying deeper than any grave. Sarah Martinez's laugh echoing across the county fair, the way her dark hair caught the light when she turned her head just so, the last time he'd seen her, standing by this very oak tree, tears streaming down her face as she told him she was leaving town. That had been September 15th, 1993. He remembered the date because it was the same day the first missing person report was filed. Jake paused, leaning on the shovel handle as his breathing steadied. The hole was already 2 feet deep, and still nothing but packed earth and the occasional root. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe the isolation of ranch life had finally gotten to him, and he was reading significance into the bizarre behavior of 3 stubborn donkeys. But then the blade struck something that wasn't earth. The sound was different, not the dull thud of hitting a root, but a hollow knock that sent a chill racing up his spine despite the warming sun. Jake dropped to his knees, brushing dirt away with his hands. His fingers found the edge of something smooth and curved. Ceramic, maybe, or glass. It was definitely glass. Working more carefully now, he cleared away the soil until the outline became visible. A mason jar, the kind his grandmother used for preserving peaches, lay on its side about 2.5 feet down. Through the dirty glass he could make out something inside, papers by the look of it, yellowed with age but protected from the elements by their glass prison. Jake's hands trembled as he worked the jar free from the earth. One of the donkeys, Buster, he thought, let out a long, mournful bray that raised goosebumps on his arms. The animal had stopped walking and was staring directly at him, its dark eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost human. The jar's metal lid was corroded but still intact. Jake twisted it carefully, feeling 30 years of rust and mineral deposits fighting against his grip. When it finally gave way with a grinding screech, the smell that escaped made him recoil. Not decay exactly, but something stale and wrong, like air that had been trapped too long in a place where it didn't belong. Inside were 3 items: a folded letter, what looked like a photograph, and a small silver locket he recognized immediately. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. The locket had belonged to Sarah. She'd worn it every day since her 16th birthday, when her grandmother had given it to her. Jake had teased her about never taking it off, had watched her nervous habit of fidgeting with the chain when she was thinking hard about something. With shaking fingers, he lifted out the letter first. The paper was old but legible, covered in handwriting he knew as well as his own. Sarah's careful script, the same hand that had written him love notes and left them in his truck back when they were both young and thought they had forever stretching out ahead of them. "Jake," the letter began, and his vision blurred for a moment. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. I know you think I left town because I didn't love you anymore, but that's not true. I could never tell you the real reason I had to go. Someone has been watching me, following me. I'm scared, Jake. I'm so scared." The letter continued, but Jake had to stop reading. His chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing his lungs with a giant fist. Sarah hadn't left him. She'd been running from someone, and judging by the fact that her most precious possession was buried under this tree instead of around her neck. He picked up the photograph with hands that felt disconnected from his body. It was a Polaroid, faded and slightly blurred, but clear enough to make out 2 figures standing beside a pickup truck. One was Sarah, looking terrified. The other was a man Jake recognized, though it took him a moment to place the face. Deputy Marshal Tom Hendricks, 20-year veteran of the County Sheriff's Department, pillar of the community. The same Tom Hendricks who had led the search for Sarah Martinez when she disappeared. The same man who had assured Jake and Sarah's family that everything possible was being done to find her. The same man who had been standing right there when Jake first called in the donkey's strange behavior 3 days ago. The metal box felt heavier in Jake's weathered hands than its size suggested, as if the weight of decades pressed down through the rusted steel. He carried it to the kitchen table, the donkey's distant braying a constant reminder that something had shifted irreversibly on his land. The box bore no lock, just a simple latch screen with age and moisture damage. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, lay a collection of items that made his blood run cold. A woman's silver bracelet, tarnished black, a driver's license in a cracked plastic sleeve, and beneath those, a folded letter sealed in a plastic bag. The license belonged to Sarah Chen, age 26, with an address in Phoenix. The photo showed a young woman with kind eyes and black hair pulled back in a ponytail. Jake's hands trembled as he recognized her face, not from memory, but from the missing person posters that had been plastered across 3 counties 30 years ago. The bracelet caught what little afternoon light filtered through his kitchen window. Delicate engravings of roses wound around its circumference, and Jake could make out an inscription on the inside, "To Sarah, my desert flower. Love, M." But it was the letter that stopped his heart entirely. The handwriting was his own. Jake stared at the yellowed paper, his mind reeling. The words swam before his eyes as fragments of a half-remembered night clawed their way to the surface. He'd been drinking heavily in those days, trying to drown out the demons that followed him home from Vietnam. There had been a woman at Murphy's bar in Millfield, someone passing through town. They'd talked for hours about places neither of them belonged to anymore. The letter was brief, written in his younger self's hurried scrawl. "Meet me at the oak tree tomorrow night. There's something I need to tell you about what I saw. Trust no one else with this. J." The paper cracked at the folds as Jake read it again, each word a nail in a coffin he'd forgotten he'd helped to build. What had he seen? What had driven him to arrange a secret meeting with a woman he'd known for one evening? Outside, thunder rumbled across the desert, though no clouds darkened the sky. The donkeys had fallen silent. Jake's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Had Sarah come to that meeting? Had something happened to her at his oak tree, the same tree the donkeys now refused to leave? The implications made his stomach churn with a sickness that went deeper than fear. He forced himself to examine the other contents of the box. A small notebook, its pages warped by moisture, contained what looked like license plate numbers and dates. Sarah's handwriting was precise, methodical, the notes of someone conducting an investigation. One entry made Jake's vision blur. Jake Morrison knows something about the trucking routes, mentions seeing unmarked vehicles. Trucking routes. The phrase triggered a cascade of fragmented memories. In the early 70s, there had been rumors about smuggling operations using the remote desert highways. Drugs, people, money, anything that needed to disappear from one place and reappear in another. Jake remembered tensions in town, whispered conversations that stopped when strangers walked into rooms. The final item in the box was a photograph, partially dissolved by water damage but still recognizable. It showed a group of men standing beside a large truck, their faces mostly obscured by shadows and the camera's poor focus. But Jake could make out enough detail to recognize the location, the old freight depot on the outskirts of Millfield, torn down 20 years ago to make way for a gas station. One figure in the background was clearer than the others, and Jake's blood turned to ice water. Sheriff Coleman Briggs, 20 pounds lighter and 30 years younger, stood with his hand on the truck's door handle. Briggs had been the one to lead the search for Sarah Chen. He'd interviewed Jake twice, casual conversations that had seemed routine at the time. Jake set the photograph down with shaking hands. If Briggs had been involved in whatever Sarah was investigating, then her disappearance hadn't been random. Someone had known she was getting close to the truth. Someone had silenced her. And Jake had written her a letter, asking her to meet him alone at the oak tree. The kitchen walls seemed to press closer as the full horror of his situation became clear. Either he had been involved in Sarah's disappearance and had blocked out the memory, or someone had used his letter to lure her to her death. Both possibilities led to the same terrifying conclusion. Sarah Chen was buried somewhere on his property, and the donkeys had found her. A truck engine rumbled up his driveway, the sound cutting through the desert silence like a blade. Jake peered through the window and felt his world tilt on its axis. Sheriff Coleman Briggs climbed out of his patrol vehicle, older now but unmistakable, his hand resting casually on his gun belt as he surveyed the ranch with eyes that missed nothing. The man who might have killed Sarah Chen had come calling. The spade hit something solid again, and this time Jake knew it wasn't a root. He'd been digging for 20 minutes since the donkeys had finally wandered off, their strange vigil apparently ended. The metal blade scraped against what felt like wood, sending a chill up his spine despite the afternoon heat. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve and peered into the hole he'd carved out between the massive oak's exposed roots. 3 feet down, the corner of what looked like an old wooden crate emerged from the dark earth. His hands trembled as he cleared away more soil, revealing weathered planks held together with rusted metal strapping. 23 years. That's how long it had been since he'd buried this box under the cover of darkness, with only the oak tree as witness. He'd convinced himself over the decades that maybe he'd imagined the whole thing, that the guilt eating at him was over something that never really happened. But there it was, exactly where he'd left it. The crate was smaller than he remembered, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. As Jake worked to free it from the earth's grip, fragments of that night came flooding back, the storm that had rolled in from the west, the way lightning had illuminated the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes, the weight of what he was carrying wrapped in an old tarp. He managed to work the box loose and hauled it up to ground level. The wood was soft with rot in places, but the metal strapping had held. Jake stared at it for a long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. Part of him wanted to bury it again, deeper this time, maybe burn the whole damn thing. But another part of him, the part that had been carrying this secret like a stone in his chest for over 2 decades, knew it was time. The rusted clasp broke easily under pressure from his knife. Jake lifted the lid and immediately wished he hadn't. The first thing he saw was fabric, a woman's blouse, faded blue with small white flowers. It was folded neatly, as if someone had been packing for a trip. Beneath that, a leather purse, its brass hardware green with tarnish. Jake's hands shook as he opened it and found a wallet inside. The driver's license was still readable despite the years of moisture. Sarah Elizabeth Manning, age 28. The photo showed a pretty woman with short, dark hair and kind eyes. Jake remembered those eyes. Remembered how they'd looked that last night, wide with fear and confusion. But it was what lay beneath the purse that made Jake's blood run cold. Wrapped in oiled cloth was a .38 revolver, his father's old service weapon, the gun he'd reported stolen from his truck 3 weeks after Sarah Manning disappeared, the gun that had never been found. Jake set the weapon aside with trembling hands and continued searching the box. At the bottom, wrapped in what looked like part of an old feed sack, he found Sarah's jewelry. A thin gold wedding band, a pair of small diamond earrings, and a locket on a delicate chain. Jake opened the locket and saw a tiny photograph of a little girl, maybe 5 years old, with Sarah's same kind eyes. The pieces of that night were coming together now, falling into place like tumblers in a lock. Jake closed his eyes and let himself remember what he'd spent 23 years trying to forget. He'd been drinking at Murphy's Tavern, celebrating the sale of his first cattle. Sarah had been there too, alone at the bar, nursing a whiskey and looking lost. They'd talked about nothing important, just the kind of conversation two lonely people have in a dim barroom. She'd mentioned she was passing through, heading west to start over somewhere new. Said she was running from something, though she never said what. Jake had offered to walk her to her car. The parking lot was dark, poorly lit. They'd been talking by her beat-up Corolla when someone approached from behind. Jake spun around and saw a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by shadow. The man had a gun. Everything after that was a blur of violence and confusion. Shouting, a struggle, the gun going off. When it was over, Sarah Manning lay motionless on the gravel, and the man in the dark coat was nowhere to be seen. Jake had panicked. Instead of calling for help, instead of doing what any decent person would do, he'd gathered up Sarah's belongings and carried her body to his truck. He'd driven out to the oak tree in the storm, dug 2 graves in the soft earth, and buried both Sarah and the evidence of what had happened. Now, staring at the contents of the box, Jake realized he'd been carrying the weight of her death all these years for nothing. The gun proved it. This wasn't some random robbery gone wrong. Someone had been hunting Sarah Manning specifically, and Jake had simply been in the way. The question was, who? And after 23 years, were they still out there? The morning sun cast long shadows across the disturbed earth as Jake stared at the hole he'd dug beneath the ancient oak. 3 feet down, his shovel had struck something that wasn't stone or root, something wrapped in oilcloth that had survived decades underground. His hands trembled as he brushed away the last of the dirt. The package was smaller than he'd expected, roughly the size of a cigar box. The donkeys had finally stopped their endless circling and now stood at the edge of the excavation, watching him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Jake lifted the bundle from its earthen grave and carried it to the porch. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon instead. Dutch courage, his father would have called it. He was going to need it. The oilcloth peeled away like old skin, revealing a metal strongbox underneath. No lock, just a simple latch green with verdigris. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth, were photographs and documents that made his blood run cold. The first photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Even after 30 years, he recognized her immediately. Sarah Martinez, the teacher who'd vanished from Copper Creek without a trace. The official story was that she'd run off with a drifter, abandoning her post and her life. But Jake knew better. He'd always known better. Beneath Sarah's photograph were others. Men in expensive suits standing next to surveying equipment. Maps of the surrounding county with red X's marking specific locations. And then, at the bottom of the stack, a letter in handwriting he recognized. "If you're reading this, then something has happened to me. Jake, I know you tried to warn me, but I couldn't let it go. They're not just stealing water rights. They're planning to dam the whole valley. The Martinez woman found out about it and tried to expose them. She's buried near the old mining camp, past Devil's Canyon. I have proof of what they did to her, but I can't trust the sheriff. He's one of them. The donkeys know. Animals always know. They've been trying to tell us for years. Your friend, Tom Brennan. Jake's vision blurred as he read the letter again. Tom Brennan had been his foreman, his friend, practically his brother. Tom had died in what everyone assumed was a riding accident, thrown from his horse and killed when his head struck a rock. But now Jake understood the truth. Tom had been murdered, just like Sarah Martinez. The water rights scheme explained everything. In the early 90s, developers had been eyeing the valley, knowing that whoever controlled the water controlled the future. Sarah, the idealistic young teacher, must have stumbled onto their plans, and Tom, loyal Tom, had tried to expose her killers. Jake's hands shook as he examined the surveying maps. The red X's marked strategic points along the river and its tributaries. If someone had managed to acquire those specific parcels of land, they could have controlled the entire watershed. The scheme would have been worth millions. A shadow fell across the porch, and Jake looked up to see Sheriff Holbrook's patrol car turning into his driveway. The irony wasn't lost on him. Holbrook was the nephew of the sheriff who'd been in charge 30 years ago, the one Tom's letter implicated in the cover-up. Jake quickly gathered the photographs and documents, stuffing them back into the strongbox. He couldn't trust anyone yet, not until he understood the full scope of what he was dealing with. For all he knew, the conspiracy that had killed Sarah and Tom might still be alive, passed down through family connections and shared secrets. Holbrook climbed out of his car, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He was younger than Jake by 20 years, with the kind of clean-shaven confidence that came from never having your worldview shattered. "Morning, Jake. Got a call about some disturbance out here. Neighbor said they heard digging in the night." "Just doing some work around the oak tree," Jake replied, gesturing toward the hole. Roots were interfering with the irrigation lines. Holbrook's eyes swept over the excavation site, taking in the scattered dirt and the 3 donkeys who still hadn't moved from their vigil. "Funny thing, animals acting strange like that. My uncle used to say they could sense things humans couldn't." The mention of his uncle sent a chill down Jake's spine. Was it coincidence, or was Holbrook fishing for information? "Your uncle was Sheriff Buck Holbrook, wasn't he?" Jake asked, keeping his voice neutral. "That's right. He told me stories about this place. Said there were always rumors about things buried on your property, old mining claims, maybe Indian artifacts." Holbrook stepped closer to the hole. "Ever find anything interesting?" Jake met his gaze steadily. Nothing but rocks and roots. But as Holbrook walked back to his patrol car, Jake noticed him speaking quietly into his radio. Whatever he was saying, Jake couldn't make out the words, but the feeling in his gut told him that the deadly game that had claimed Sarah Martinez and Tom Brennan was far from over. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the faded photograph in his palm. The image showed a younger version of himself, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and flowing auburn hair. Between them stood a girl, maybe 8 years old, grinning widely with missing front teeth. Sarah and Emma Morrison, a family he'd tried to forget for 30 years. The wind picked up, rattling the oak's ancient branches above him. The 3 donkeys had finally stopped their endless circling and now stood motionless, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was as if they knew what he'd found, what memories were clawing their way back to the surface. He'd buried this box himself, all those years ago, right here beneath the gnarled roots of the oak tree that had served as his landmark. But he'd never meant for anyone to find it, especially not like this. The donkeys had somehow sensed what lay beneath the earth, their hooves wearing a perfect circle around the tree until the soil loosened enough for the metal corner to peek through. Jake pulled out another item from the rusted box, a child's bracelet with tiny silver horses dangling from the chain. Emma's bracelet. She'd worn it every day, even to bed, claiming the horses would gallop through her dreams and take her on adventures. His throat tightened, as he remembered helping her clasp it around her small wrist that last morning. The morning everything changed. Footsteps crunched on dry leaves behind him. Jake spun around, shoving the photograph into his shirt pocket while palming his coat. Deputy Martinez emerged from the tree line, her badge catching the late afternoon sun. "Saw your truck from the road, Jake. Everything all right out here?" She paused, taking in the disturbed earth and the open metal box. "What'd you find?" Jake's mind raced. Maria Martinez was sharp, too sharp for her own good sometimes. She'd been asking questions around town about the Morrison case ever since she'd transferred to their county 6 months ago. Questions that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Just some old junk," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Previous owner must have buried it." Maria stepped closer, her dark eyes scanning the contents of the box. "That's interesting. This ranch has been in your family for generations, hasn't it? Hard to imagine a previous owner." The statement hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. He'd forgotten that detail, forgotten the story he'd told everyone about buying this land. After 30 years, the lies had started to blur together. "My grandfather bought it from a family that was heading west," Jake improvised. "Must have been in a hurry to leave, left all sorts of things behind." One of the donkeys snorted, a sound almost like bitter laughter. Maria's gaze shifted to the animals, then back to the box. She crouched down, and Jake's heart hammered as she reached toward the contents. "Don't!" he said sharply. Her hand froze. "Why not?" "Could be dangerous. Might be old chemicals, rat poison. Who knows what people buried back then?" Maria straightened slowly, her hand resting on her service weapon. The gesture wasn't lost on Jake. "You know, I've been reading about an old case. Family that disappeared from these parts back in '93. Sarah and Emma Morrison. Ever hear that name?" Jake's blood turned to ice water. "Can't say I have." Strange thing about that case. The husband, Frank Morrison, claimed his wife and daughter just up and left one day. But here's what bothers me. Sarah's sister in Denver says she never heard from them. And Emma's teacher said the girl was excited about a school project she was supposed to present the following week. Doesn't sound like someone planning to run away. The deputy's words hit Jake like physical blows. He remembered that school project, something about local wildlife. Emma had been practicing her presentation for days, using him as her audience while Sarah cooked dinner in their little cabin. Their cabin that had sat right where this oak tree now dominated the landscape. "You feeling all right, Jake? You look pale." He realized he'd been staring at the tree, lost in memories he'd spent decades trying to bury deeper than any box. "Just tired. Long day." Maria nodded, but her eyes remained suspicious. "I'll be in touch about that box. Might want to have someone take a look at those contents, just to be safe." She paused at the edge of the clearing. "And Jake, if you remember anything about the Morrisons, anything at all, you know where to find me." As her footsteps faded, Jake sank to his knees beside the box. The donkeys moved closer, forming a protective circle around him. He pulled out the photograph again, studying Sarah's trusting smile, Emma's innocent joy. They'd trusted him completely, right up until the end. The shovel bit deep into the earth with a satisfying thunk, but Jake's satisfaction was short-lived. 3 feet down, the blade struck something that wasn't root or rock. The metallic clang echoed off the oak's massive trunk, and the donkeys, still maintaining their vigil in a wider circle now, lifted their heads in unison. Jake's weathered hands trembled as he knelt and brushed away the loose soil. The corner of what looked like a metal box emerged from the dirt, its surface green with age and corrosion. His heart hammered against his ribs as memories he'd buried deeper than any treasure came rushing back. 43 years. 43 years since he'd last seen anything like this. The box was smaller than he'd expected, about the size of a shoebox, but made of heavy steel. As he worked to free it from the earth's grip, Jake's mind raced back to that summer of 1980, when he'd been nothing but a 25-year-old ranch hand working for Old Man Hensley. back when Sarah Martinez had been the prettiest girl in 3 counties, and when her brother Miguel had trusted Jake like family. The box came free with a wet, sucking sound. Jake sat back on his heels, staring at it as if it might explode. The lock had long since rusted away, leaving only a corroded hasp that crumbled at his touch. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled cloth, lay a collection of items that made his blood turn to ice water. A tarnished silver locket, a man's wallet, the leather cracked but still intact, and underneath it all, a yellowed envelope with his own name written across it in Miguel's distinctive handwriting. Jake's vision blurred. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the envelope. The donkeys had stopped their circling entirely now, standing like sentinels as he opened what felt like a message from the grave. The letter inside was brief, written in Spanish first, then English, as Miguel always did when something was important. "Jake, if you're reading this, then the truth has found its way to the surface like it always does. I know what happened that night at Devil's Canyon. I know why Sarah never came home. I know you didn't mean for it to happen, hermano, but I also know you let everyone believe she ran off with that drifter when you could have told us where to look for her body. I've kept your secret for 3 months now, watching you struggle with it, waiting for you to do the right thing, but I can see you're going to let them keep searching the highways instead of the canyon. I can see you're going to let our mother die wondering. So here's what's going to happen. I'm leaving this where only you'll find it, along with the things I took from your room, the locket you pulled off her neck, the wallet you forgot to ditch. Insurance, you might call it. You're going to leave Broken Creek County, Jake, tonight. You're never coming back, and you're never going to contact any of us again. In return, this box stays buried, and Sarah's accident stays between us. But if I ever see your face in this county again, if you ever try to come back to the life you don't deserve, I'll dig this up and take it straight to Sheriff Castellanos. Go live with what you've done, hermano. It's more mercy than my sister got." The letter fluttered from Jake's nerveless fingers. He remembered that night now with crystalline clarity, the argument at the dance, Sarah running off angry, him following her to apologize, the loose rocks at Devil's Canyon rim giving way under her boots as she'd spun around to face him, the sickening sound of her body hitting the rocks below, his panic, his cowardice, his decision to say nothing when she was declared a runaway. He'd left town the next morning, telling himself Miguel would never know, but Miguel had always been too smart, too observant. He must have seen Jake's guilt written all over his face, must have investigated, must have found evidence Jake thought he'd hidden. And now Miguel was dead, had been for 8 years, and the secret he'd taken to his grave was literally surfacing. Jake looked around the ranch he'd built, the life he'd constructed on the foundation of his lie. The donkeys watched him with their dark, knowing eyes, as if they understood the weight of what had been unearthed. His phone buzzed. A text message from a number he didn't recognize. "We need to talk. Meet me at the old Hensley place at midnight. Come alone. A friend of Miguel's." The phone slipped from his grip, landing in the soft earth beside Sarah's locket. Someone else knew. Someone had been watching, waiting. The past he thought he'd buried was clawing its way back to the surface, and this time there might be nowhere left to run. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the oak tree's branches in shades of blood and gold, Jake Martinez understood that his 43 years of borrowed time had finally run out. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a plume of red dust as it disappeared down the ranch road, leaving Jake alone with the weight of what he'd just confessed. 27 years of silence, shattered in the span of an hour. He stood on his porch, watching until the taillights vanished behind the mesquite trees, then walked back to where the donkeys still maintained their vigil around the oak. They'd barely moved since his return from town. Occasionally one would shift position or flick an ear at a fly, but their eyes remained fixed on the disturbed earth where Martha's bones had emerged from their decades-long rest. Jake had seen animals react strangely to death before, but this felt different, ancient, like they were keeping watch over something that went deeper than bone and sinew. The afternoon sun slanted low, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jake pulled his hat down against the glare and studied the excavation site. The crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, bright yellow against the dark soil. Tomorrow, Sheriff Rodriguez would return with the state forensics team. They'd sift through every grain of dirt, catalogue every fragment, try to piece together the final moments of Martha Calloway's life. But Jake already knew the story they'd find. He'd been carrying it like a stone in his chest for nearly 3 decades. A sound from the house made him turn. The screen door hung open, creaking on its hinges. He was certain he'd latched it before the sheriff arrived. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the .45 at his hip as he approached the porch. The boards groaned under his boots, each step deliberate and quiet. Inside, the house felt different, cooler. The air seemed to thicken as he moved through the hallway, past the faded photographs of his parents and the old land grants that traced his family's claim to this piece of Texas back to 1887. Nothing appeared disturbed, but Jake had learned to trust his instincts. Something was wrong. In the kitchen, a glass of water sat on the counter. Ice cubes floated in it, condensation beading on the sides. Jake touched the glass, cold, fresh. He hadn't poured any water before going outside. A floorboard creaked overhead. Jake drew his pistol and moved toward the stairs, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He'd faced down rustlers, wildcats, and drunken cowhands over the years. Whatever was in his house wouldn't be the first uninvited guest he'd dealt with. The stairs protested under his weight no matter how carefully he placed his feet. At the top, he paused, listening. The house held 3 bedrooms and a bathroom, all connected by a narrow hallway that ran the length of the second floor. Afternoon light filtered through the windows, creating a patchwork of shadow and gold. "I know you're up here," Jake said quietly. "Might as well show yourself." A door opened at the far end of the hall. A figure stepped out, tall, lean, wearing a black coat despite the heat. The man's face was weathered by sun and time, framed by silver hair that hung past his shoulders. Jake had seen that face in his nightmares for 27 years. "Hello, Jake." The voice was exactly as Jake remembered it, soft, almost musical, with an accent that suggested education and travel. Thomas Calloway looked older, certainly, but time had been kinder to him than it had been to his missing sister. "You're supposed to be dead," Jake said, keeping his gun trained on the man who'd haunted his past. Thomas smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Reports of my death, as they say. I find it useful to let people believe what they want to believe. Makes it easier to move around, to watch, to wait." "Wait for what?" "For someone to find Martha, of course. I've been keeping track of this place for years, Jake. Waiting for the right moment. The donkeys were inspired, I'll admit. Even I didn't expect that." Jake's blood chilled. "You've been here before." "Many times. Your security has always been rather lax. I've walked these halls, sat in your kitchen, even slept in your barn on occasion. Amazing what you can accomplish when everyone thinks you're dead." The gun felt heavy in Jake's hand. "What do you want?" Thomas moved closer, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. "Justice, Jake. My sister deserved better than a shallow grave under that tree. She deserved better than being forgotten while her killer played at being an honest rancher. I never meant for her to die. Intent is irrelevant now. What matters is what happens next." Thomas reached into his coat and produced an envelope, yellow with age. "I've been carrying this for 27 years. Martha's final letter, the one she never had a chance to mail. Would you like to know what it says?" Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. After all these years, he needed to know. The bone fragment felt heavier in Jake's weathered palm than its size warranted, as if it carried the weight of 30 years' worth of buried truth. He set it carefully on his kitchen table next to the faded photograph of Sarah Martinez, the 17-year-old girl who'd vanished without a trace during the summer of 1993. The same summer he'd been too drunk and too angry to notice much of anything beyond his own misery. Thunder rumbled overhead as Jake stared at the evidence before him. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, sending sheets of rain against his windows. He poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, then thought better of it and put the bottle away. Whatever came next, he needed a clear head. The phone rang, cutting through the sound of rain on tin roof. Jake hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be Sheriff Collins with more questions he wasn't ready to face. "Jake, it's Maria Santos." The voice hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah's sister, though she'd been Maria Martinez back then, barely 15 when her older sister disappeared. Jake had avoided her family for 3 decades, carrying his guilt like a stone in his chest. "I heard about what you found," she continued when he didn't respond. "Doc Henderson called me, said they're running tests on the bones. Maria, I'm driving up from El Paso. I'll be there tomorrow morning." The line went dead. Jake set the phone down with shaking hands and walked to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could make out the ancient oak tree, its massive trunk barely visible in the storm. The donkeys had finally moved away from it, seeking shelter in the barn, but their weeks of circling had worn a perfect ring in the earth around those gnarled roots. He thought about that summer again, about the heat and the drought that had killed half his cattle, about the bottle that had become his only companion after Ellen left with their son, about the night Sarah Martinez had come to his ranch, desperate and terrified, begging for help he'd been too drunk to give. The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. Sarah pounding on his door past midnight, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Behind her, headlights had swept across his property before disappearing down the gravel road. She'd been babbling about needing to hide, about someone following her, about how she couldn't go to the police because they wouldn't believe her. Jake had been 3 sheets to the wind, barely able to stand upright. He'd told her to go home, to stop bothering him with teenage drama. The last thing he remembered was Sarah backing away from his door, fear replacing the hope in her dark eyes. By morning, he'd convinced himself it had been a drunken hallucination. When news of her disappearance spread through town days later, he'd kept his mouth shut, too ashamed to admit he might have been the last person to see her alive. Now, staring at that bone fragment on his table, Jake realized Sarah had never made it home that night. Somehow, she'd ended up buried beneath the oak tree that had stood sentinel over his property for more than a century. The rain intensified, and Jake found himself thinking about the changes to his land over the years. The old fence line that used to run near the oak had been moved twice. The irrigation ditches had been rerouted after the drought. Anyone could have buried something there without him knowing, especially during those months when he'd been too drunk to pay attention to anything beyond his own self-pity. But who, and why his property? Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. Sarah had been running from someone that night, someone with headlights and presumably a vehicle, someone who'd followed her to his ranch and then, waited for her to leave, confronted her before she could reach the road. The bourbon called to him from the cabinet, but Jake resisted. Instead, he pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing down everything he could remember about that night. Every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The color of the headlights, the make of engine he'd heard idling in his driveway, the way Sarah had kept looking over her shoulder. As he wrote, fragments of suppressed memory began surfacing. Sarah mentioning a name he hadn't heard clearly. Something about photographs and a man who wouldn't leave her alone. Her saying she had proof of something that would ruin someone important. Jake's pencil stopped moving. In 1993, the most important man in their small county had been Judge Harold Brennan, a family friend of the Collins clan who'd wielded considerable influence until his death 5 years ago. The same man whose grandson now wore a sheriff's badge and had been asking pointed questions about what Jake might have seen or heard 30 years ago. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture Jake wasn't sure he was ready to see. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning silence like a blade through canvas. Jake pressed himself against the barn wall, watching as Sheriff Morrison and 2 deputies rode up the main path to the house. Their movements were deliberate, practiced, the kind of approach lawmen made when they weren't expecting to be welcomed. From his hiding spot, Jake could see Clara through the kitchen window, her hands moving in quick, nervous gestures as she prepared coffee. She'd been up since before dawn, pacing the house like a caged animal. The weight of last night's revelations hung between them, heavier than storm clouds. Morrison dismounted first, his weathered face set in the grim expression Jake had seen too many times before. The sheriff's eyes swept the property, taking in details with the sharp focus of a man who'd spent decades reading crime scenes. When his gaze lingered on the oak tree in the distance, Jake's stomach clenched. "Mrs. Thornton," Morrison called out as Clara appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "We need to speak with your husband." "Jake's out checking the fence line," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor Jake could detect. "Won't be back for hours, I'd imagine." The lie rolled off her tongue with surprising ease, but Morrison wasn't buying it. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the barnyard again, noting the fresh boot prints in the mud near the water trough. "Mind if we wait inside? Got some questions about that business up by the old oak." Jake's blood turned to ice water. They knew. Somehow they'd put the pieces together. Maybe someone had seen the fresh earth around the tree, or perhaps Morrison had finally connected the dots between Tommy Chen's disappearance and the strange behavior of those damned donkeys. As the lawmen filed into his house, Jake slipped around the barn's far side, keeping to the shadows. His mind raced through possibilities, escape routes, explanations that might hold water. But 30 years of guilt had taught him that the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you buried it. The 3 donkeys stood near the oak tree, still as sentinels now, their eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Even from this distance, he could see the dark patch of earth where they'd worn away the grass with their endless circling, the spot where Tommy Chen's bones lay waiting to tell their story. Movement from the house caught his attention. Through the window he could see Morrison gesturing animatedly while Clara sat rigid in her chair. One of the deputies had positioned himself near the back door, standard procedure when you expected your suspect might run. Jake's hand instinctively went to the Colt at his hip, then fell away. Violence had started this whole mess, it wouldn't end it. Besides, Clara was in that house, and he'd be damned if he'd put her in harm's way because of his sins. A memory surfaced unbidden. Tommy Chen's face that night 30 years ago, young and defiant even as Jake's fist connected with his jaw. The kid had been asking too many questions about the cattle rustling operation, getting too close to evidence that would have sent half the county to prison. Jake had only meant to scare him, to convince him to leave town and forget what he'd seen. But Tommy had fought back, hard and desperate. In the struggle, the boy's head had struck the corner of the stone well with a sound like a breaking branch. Jake could still hear that sound in his nightmares, still see the way Tommy's eyes had gone vacant and still. Panic had driven Jake's actions then, dragging the body to the oak tree, digging by moonlight while the guilt ate at him like acid. He'd told himself it was an accident, that revealing the truth would only destroy more lives. The rustling operation had disbanded within the week anyway, the participants scattering to the wind like leaves. Now, watching Morrison's silhouette through the kitchen window, Jake realized his time had finally run out. The donkeys had been harbingers, messengers from a past that refused to stay buried. Their circling had been a kind of justice, wearing away the earth until the truth lay exposed. He could run. The Mexican border was only 2 days' hard ride south, and he still had friends who'd ask no questions. But Clara would suffer for his cowardice, and Tommy Chen's family deserved to know what had happened to their son. They deserved to bring him home. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and regret, Jake Thornton stepped out from behind the barn and walked toward his house. Each step felt like a small death, but also like a weight lifting from shoulders that had carried their burden for far too long. The reckoning he'd spent 3 decades avoiding was finally at hand. The shovel blade struck something hard with a metallic clang that echoed through the twilight air. Jake's hands trembled as he brushed away the last of the dirt, revealing the corner of a weathered metal box. His breath came in short bursts, each exhale visible in the cooling evening air. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, though part of him had known this moment would come eventually. The donkeys had finally stopped their endless circling and now stood watching him with what seemed like expectant eyes. The box was heavier than he'd anticipated, roughly the size of a tackle box, but made of some kind of military-grade metal that had resisted the decades of burial surprisingly well. A combination lock secured the lid, its numbers worn smooth by time and handling. Jake turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of secrets within. As he carried the box toward the house, his mind raced through possibilities. Tommy Kellerman had vanished 37 years ago, and Jake had spent every day since trying to forget the circumstances. But Tommy had been thorough, even as a young man. If he'd hidden something here, under this tree, it meant he'd known trouble was coming. Inside the kitchen, Jake set the box on the table under the harsh fluorescent light. The combination lock stared back at him mockingly. He tried Tommy's birthday first, nothing. Then the date of his disappearance, still nothing. Jake rubbed his temples, trying to think like his old friend. Then it hit him. The date of their last cattle drive together, when they discovered the Hendricks gang's rustling operation, when everything had started to go sideways. His fingers worked the combination, August 15th, 1987. The lock clicked open. Jake hesitated before lifting the lid. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But the donkey's behavior, the journalist's questions, the strange feeling that someone had been watching the ranch, everything pointed to this moment being inevitable. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were photographs. Dozens of them. Jake's hands shook as he spread them across the table. The images were grainy, clearly taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, but they were damning. Sheriff Morrison shaking hands with known cattle thieves, County Commissioner Bradley accepting an envelope thick with cash, Judge Patterson sharing drinks with men Jake recognized as part of the Hendricks operation. But it was the final photograph that made Jake's blood run cold. It showed himself, younger and desperate, meeting with Morrison behind the courthouse. The sheriff was handing him something. Jake remembered now. It had been money, payment for his silence about what he and Tommy had witnessed on the range. Beneath the photos was a letter, written in Tommy's careful handwriting. Jake, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. I know you took Morrison's money. I know you're scared. Hell, I'm scared too. But we can't let them destroy everything decent about this county. These photos are my insurance policy, but if I'm gone, they're your burden now. The people deserve to know the truth about Morrison and his cronies. I've made copies. One set is with my lawyer in Denver, sealed with instructions that will surface if I disappear. But I wanted you to have these too, because I know deep down you're still the good man I rode with all those years. Don't let my death be for nothing. TK. Jake sank into his chair, the weight of 37 years of guilt pressing down on him like a physical force. Tommy had known about the bribe, about Jake's cowardice, and had still trusted him with the truth. A sound outside made him look up sharply. Headlights were approaching down the long drive, moving slowly, deliberately. Jake quickly gathered the photos and letter, stuffing them back into the box. His heart hammered as he recognized Sheriff Morrison's patrol car. The old sheriff stepped out, his movements careful and measured. He was older now, grayer, but Jake could see the same cold calculation in his eyes that had been there all those years ago. Morrison approached the front door but didn't knock. Instead, he called out, "Evening, Jake. Saw your lights on. Thought we might have a chat." Jake glanced at the box, then at the back door. Morrison's voice carried the weight of authority, but underneath it was something else. Concern. Fear, maybe. "Been a long time since we had a proper conversation," Morrison continued. "Lot of old memories stirring up lately. That journalist's been asking questions all over town, curious about things that are best left buried." Jake moved to the window and peered out. Morrison stood alone, but that didn't mean backup wasn't nearby. The sheriff's hand rested casually on his service weapon. "I'm thinking you and I need to discuss recent developments," Morrison said, his voice growing harder. "Particularly any digging you might have been doing around that old oak tree." The metal box seemed to burn where Jake's hand touched it. Tommy's sacrifice, his trust, his desperate hope for justice, it all came down to this moment. The storm hit just as Jake finished loading the last of the evidence into his truck. Rain lashed against the windshield in sheets so thick he could barely make out the ranch house through the darkness. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ancient oak in stark relief, its gnarled branches reaching toward the heavens like accusatory fingers. He should have left hours ago, should have driven straight to Sheriff Martinez with what he'd found beneath those roots. But something had kept him rooted to this place, some invisible thread connecting him to the bones and tattered remnants of clothing that had emerged from the earth like long-buried sins seeking absolution. The donkeys had finally stopped their endless circling. They stood now in the shelter of the barn, watching him through the rain with those dark, knowing eyes, as if they understood their vigil was complete, their purpose fulfilled after all these years of keeping watch over secrets that had festered in the darkness. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the ignition, and it wasn't from the cold. In the passenger seat, wrapped in an old tarp, lay the evidence that would destroy everything he'd built since coming to this god-forsaken piece of Texas 30 years ago. The identity documents he'd found with the remains bore a name he'd hoped never to hear again: William Garrett. Billy Garrett. The hotshot young deputy who'd asked too many questions about the Valdez family's disappearance back in '92. The same deputy who'd vanished without a trace just days before Jake, then known by a different name, had quietly resigned from the Amarillo Police Department and disappeared into the anonymity of ranch life. Thunder crashed overhead, and Jake flinched as if God himself was passing judgment. He'd been running from this moment for 3 decades, building a new identity one careful lie at a time. Now those lies were unraveling like cheap rope in a windstorm. The truck's headlights cut through the rains as he finally started the engine. But instead of heading toward town, Jake found himself driving deeper into his property, toward the old line shack where he'd spent countless nights planning his escape from the past. The building materialized out of the storm like a ghost, its weathered boards barely holding back the elements. Inside, Jake lit a kerosene lamp and pulled out the file he'd hidden behind a loose board years ago. Insurance, he'd called it then, evidence of his own innocence in case the past ever caught up with him. But looking at it now, the photographs and documents seemed more like the tools of his own damnation. The Valdez family had been asking questions about their missing son, Eduardo, who'd been found dead in what the department had ruled a gang shooting. But Eduardo had been talking to someone before he died, claiming he had information about corruption in the police force, information that certain people would kill to keep quiet. Billy Garrett had been getting close to the truth, too close. And certain members of the force, Jake's former colleagues, had decided the young deputy posed an unacceptable risk. They'd come to Jake, knowing his reputation for solving problems quietly, expecting his loyalty. Instead, Jake had tried to warn Billy, had tried to convince him to back off, to let sleeping dogs lie, but the kid was stubborn, idealistic. He'd believed in justice the way Jake once had, before years of looking the other way had corroded his soul. The night Billy disappeared, Jake had been working late, alone in the evidence room. The official story was that he'd gone home sick, but the truth was darker, more complicated. He'd been there when they brought Billy in, unconscious and bloodied, had watched as they discussed what to do with a problem that wouldn't disappear on its own. Jake had made a choice that night. Not the right choice. He wasn't sure such a thing existed anymore, but the only choice his conscience could bear. He'd helped them load Billy's body into a truck, helped them drive out to what would eventually become Jake's own ranch. But while they'd been digging the grave beneath the oak tree, Jake had been planning his own disappearance. By morning, both Billy Garrett and Detective Marcus Cole, Jake's former identity, had vanished from Amarillo. One into the earth, the other into a carefully constructed new life built on silence and distance. The lamp flickered in the wind that found its way through the shack's gaps, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jake stared at his reflection in the black window, seeing not the weathered rancher he'd become, but the haunted face of the man who'd stood by and watched justice die. Outside, the storm raged on, but Jake could feel something shifting in the darkness. The weight of 30 years was pressing down on him, demanding payment for debts too long deferred. The donkeys had delivered their message, the earth had given up its secrets, and now there was nowhere left to run. The reckoning he'd spent 3 decades avoiding was finally at hand, and Jake knew that by morning, one way or another, the truth would set him free or destroy him completely. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the ranch road, leaving Jake alone with the weight of what he'd just confessed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and for the first time in decades, he felt something approaching peace settling in his chest. But that feeling evaporated the moment he saw the black sedan pulling up his driveway. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his hip. Finding only empty leather, he turned his gun over to Sheriff Martinez an hour ago, along with his statement about what had really happened to Marcus Delacroix 43 years ago. The sedan's windows were tinted dark enough that he couldn't make out the occupants, but he didn't need to see faces to know trouble when it arrived in a vehicle that expensive. The car stopped 20 feet from his porch. 2 men emerged, both wearing suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The driver was tall and lean with silver hair, while his passenger was younger, broader, with the kind of build that suggested violence was just another tool in his professional toolkit. "Mr. Morrison," the older man called out, adjusting his tie as he approached. "Beautiful ranch you have here. Very isolated." Jake stayed on his porch, one hand resting on the weathered railing. "Don't get many visitors in suits out this way. You boys lost?" The man smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Not lost at all. In fact, we've been looking for this place for quite some time. My name is Vincent Delacroix. I believe you knew my father." The blood in Jake's veins turned to ice water. He kept his expression neutral, a skill learned through decades of poker games and harder conversations than this one. "Delacroix. Can't say the name rings a bell." "No? That's interesting, considering you just spent an hour telling the sheriff all about how you killed Marcus Delacroix back in 1981. Vincent pulled out a small recording device, Jake's own voice emerging from the speaker in tinny clarity. "I shot him twice in the chest. He went down hard." Jake's jaw tightened. "Sheriff's office bugged now?" "Not officially, but when you have the right connections and enough money, information has a way of finding you." Vincent pocketed the device. "My father disappeared when I was 12 years old. Do you have any idea what it's like, growing up wondering if your father abandoned you or if something terrible happened to him?" "I imagine it's hard," Jake said quietly. "But some men make choices that lead them down dark roads." The younger man stepped forward, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal a shoulder holster. "You talking about our father or yourself, old man?" Vincent raised a hand, stopping his companion. "Easy, Anthony. Mr. Morrison here is going to help us understand exactly what happened. Aren't you, Jake? Already told the sheriff everything. Your father came here looking to hurt someone I cared about. I stopped him. End of story." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong." Vincent's smile widened. "You see, my father wasn't just some common criminal. He was connected to some very powerful people in New Orleans. People who invested considerable money in certain enterprises that disappeared along with him." Jake felt the pieces clicking together like bullets sliding into a chamber. "You're not here about dear old Dad. You're here about money. $2.3 million to be precise. Money that belonged to people who don't simply write off losses and move on with their lives." Vincent began walking slowly toward the porch. "My father was carrying that money when he came to see you. Money that should have been delivered to clients who are still very much alive and still very much interested in getting it back. Don't know anything about any money." Anthony laughed, a sound like breaking glass. 40 years of interest, old-timer. We're talking about $8 million now. You think we're just going to take your word that you don't know nothing?" Jake's mind raced. He thought about the metal box they'd found buried with Marcus's body, the one Sheriff Martinez had catalogued as evidence. There'd been some cash inside, maybe a few $1,000s, but nothing like what these men were talking about. Either Marcus had hidden the bulk of the money somewhere else, or your father never made it this far with your money, Jake said slowly. Whatever happened to it happened before he got to my ranch. Vincent's pleasant mask finally slipped. You're lying! Think about it. If I'd had access to $2 million 40 years ago, you think I'd still be running cattle on a patch of scrub like this? Jake gestured at his modest spread. I'd have been long gone. The two men exchanged glances. Anthony's hand drifted toward his jacket, but Vincent shook his head slightly. Perhaps, Vincent said finally, but you're still the last person who saw my father alive, which means you're going to help us retrace his steps. Every single one. The donkeys chose that moment to start braying from their pasture, their voices carrying across the ranch like a warning. Jake looked toward the sound, then back at the two men who represented everything he'd tried to leave behind. Seems like the past ain't quite ready to stay buried, he murmured. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up a cloud of dust as it pulled away from the ranch, leaving Jake alone with the weight of his confession and the skeletal remains that had finally seen daylight after 30 years underground. The FBI would arrive within hours, Detective Morrison had warned, and everything would change then. For now, Jake stood at the edge of the excavation site, staring down at what remained of Marcus Wheeler. The three donkeys had returned to their endless circling, as if their vigil wasn't complete. Bess, Clementine, and old Rufus moved with that same hypnotic rhythm that had started this whole unraveling. Jake watched them, wondering if animals could sense things that humans had forgotten how to feel. Maybe they'd been trying to tell him all along that some secrets refused to stay buried. His cell phone buzzed against his chest. Sarah's name appeared on the cracked screen, and Jake's stomach clenched. She'd be expecting him for dinner, probably had the table set and the coffee brewing. How do you tell someone that the man they've been sharing a bed with for 15 years is a killer? How do you explain that the careful life you've built together is constructed on a foundation of lies and buried bones? Hey, darling, he answered, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. You sound tired, Sarah said immediately. She'd always been able to read him, even through a phone line. Everything okay out there? You've been gone all day. Jake closed his eyes, listening to the concern in her voice. In a few hours, she'd know everything. The FBI would want to interview her, would turn their home upside down looking for evidence. The media would descend like vultures, and Sarah's quiet life would become a circus. Just dealing with some ranch business, he said. Listen, Sarah, I need you to know something. Whatever happens in the next few days, whatever you hear about me, I want you to remember that loving you has been the best part of my life. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Jake, you're scaring me. What's going on? I'll explain everything soon, but right now, I need you to pack a bag and go stay with your sister in Amarillo for a while. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening. Jake smiled despite everything. Sarah's stubborn streak was one of the things he'd fallen in love with, but right now it was going to make things harder. Please, Sarah, trust me on this. Pack enough for a week and leave before sunset. I'll call you tonight and explain everything. After she hung up, Jake pocketed the phone and walked to the barn. His hands moved automatically through the evening chores, feeding the horses and checking water troughs, but his mind was miles away. He thought about Marcus Wheeler's sister, Patricia, who'd spent 30 years wondering what happened to her brother. She deserved answers, deserved to finally lay him to rest properly. The irony wasn't lost on Jake, that he'd become a better man by running from the worst thing he'd ever done. The fear of discovery had kept him honest, kept him working to deserve the life he'd built, but maybe that was just another lie he'd been telling himself. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Jake heard the distant rumble of engines. Not the FBI yet, but close. He walked back to the excavation site, where the local coroner's team was carefully extracting the remains. They worked with respectful efficiency, treating Marcus Wheeler's bones with more dignity than Jake had shown him 3 decades ago. Detective Morrison approached, his expression unreadable. "The FBI team will be here in an hour. They'll want to interview you formally, probably take you back to town." Jake nodded. "I understand. You did the right thing today, Jake. I know it wasn't easy." "Nothing about this has been easy," Jake replied. "But you're right. It was past time." The donkeys had stopped their circling and now stood in a line, watching the proceedings with those ancient, knowing eyes. Whatever had driven them to their strange vigil seemed satisfied now. Bess lifted her head and looked directly at Jake, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw understanding in her gaze. The sound of vehicles approaching grew louder, and Jake straightened his shoulders. 30 years of running was about to end, and the reckoning he'd always known would come was finally here. He thought about Sarah, hoped she was packing her bags like he'd asked. He thought about the ranch, about whether it would survive the scandal that was about to break. But mostly, he thought about Marcus Wheeler and the debt that was finally going to be paid. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Jake knelt beside the freshly filled grave beneath the ancient oak. The donkeys had finally stopped their endless circling, now grazing peacefully in the distance as if their vigil was complete. In his weathered hands, he held the small jewelry box that had started it all. Sarah's jewelry box, the one she'd treasured as a child. Sheriff Martinez approached slowly, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. "The state boys finished their work about an hour ago. They confirmed what we already knew." He paused, removing his hat. "Sarah's been laid to rest proper now." Jake nodded without looking up. After 43 years, his sister finally had the burial she deserved. The twisted metal and bones they'd unearthed told the story he'd suspected but never wanted to face. The Hendersons had killed her when she'd discovered their cattle rustling operation, then buried her and the evidence beneath the tree, counting on time and silence to keep their secrets safe. "What about the Hendersons?" Jake's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Old man Henderson died in prison 2 winters back. His son Billy's been picked up in Tucson. Seems guilt's been eating at him for years. He's already talking, wants to make a deal." Martinez settled his hat back on his head. He claims it was all his father's idea, that Sarah just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jake's fingers tightened around the jewelry box. Wrong place, wrong time. As if his 15-year-old sister's murder was just bad luck instead of cold-blooded murder. "And the rustling ring?" "Bigger than we thought. They'd been stealing cattle from ranches across 3 counties for decades. Your sister must have seen something that spooked them." Martinez's expression darkened. Billy says his father panicked, thought she'd go to the law. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. If the Hendersons had just let her go, Sarah might have kept quiet. She'd always been more interested in her books and dreams than ranch business. But fear had made them killers, and killers they'd remained. "There's something else," Martinez continued. "Billy mentioned your father. Says the old man suspected something after Sarah disappeared, started asking too many questions around town." Jake's breath caught. He remembered those final months before his father's heart attack. How haunted he'd looked, how he'd taken to riding the fence lines at all hours. "You think they killed him too?" "Can't prove it. But Billy got real quiet when I pressed him about it. Your father's death was ruled natural causes, but..." Martinez shrugged. "Lot of ways to give a man with a weak heart the kind of scare that might stop it permanent." The wind picked up, rustling the oak's ancient leaves. Jake stood slowly, his joints protesting after a sleepless night spent keeping vigil over the excavation. 2 graves now lay beneath the spreading branches, one fresh and proper, one old and secret. Sarah's remains had been moved to the family plot in town, but the tree would forever mark where she'd waited for justice. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Billy'll likely plead guilty to accessory charges. Won't bring Sarah back, but he'll do time." Martinez studied Jake's weathered face. "Question is, what happens to you? This ranch has seen a lot of ghosts put to rest." Jake looked out across the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The same land where his sister had died, where his father had grieved himself into an early grave, where 3 stubborn donkeys had refused to let the dead stay buried. For decades, he'd carried the weight of not knowing, the guilt of giving up the search too soon. Now, with the truth finally exposed, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: peace. "I'm staying," he said finally. "This is Sarah's place too, now that she's properly buried. Someone needs to tend her grave, keep her memory alive." Martinez nodded approvingly. "Those donkeys of yours, they're something special, almost like they knew." Jake smiled for the first time in days. "Animals see things we miss sometimes. They feel what the land remembers." He tucked the jewelry box into his jacket pocket. "Reckon I owe them extra hay for a while." As the sheriff walked back to his patrol car, Jake remained beneath the oak tree. The burden he'd carried for 43 years had lifted, replaced not by emptiness, but by purpose. Sarah's story would be told now, her death avenged, her memory honored. The donkeys wandered closer, their large eyes gentle and knowing. Jake reached out to stroke the nearest one's neck, feeling the warmth of living flesh beneath his palm. "Thank you," he whispered to them, to the tree, to his sister's spirit. "Thank you for not letting me forget." The wind carried his words across the ranch, across the years, carrying them to a place where the dead could finally rest and the living could begin to heal.